On today's show, it's a new week, and the Atlanta Hawks are getting very, very close to starting a new season. We'll touch on your mailbag questions, expansion talk, and much more on today's show, and all that is coming up.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1803 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Monday here in late September. And today's podcast is brought to you by the folks at FanDuel. You can start the season and with a big return at FanDuel Sportsbook. Place your first $5 bet. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. I want to also encourage you at the top of the podcast, as I always do, to make us your first listen each and every day here at Locked On Hawks. Check out the podcast and subscribe to the show anywhere you find your podcasts. That includes Apple and Spotify and Overcast, Amazon Music, etc. We're also on YouTube. Please like this episode as you are watching it and subscribe on that video platform. It's been busy on the show. We had a five-show week last week on the podcast, ramping up little by little to the actual start to the season. And as I record this podcast on Monday, we are 1 week to Media Day. So we're getting very close. That's kind of the official start to the season. So from that point forward, it is all systems go, training camp, preseason, regular season games that count, et cetera, et cetera. I'm doing this podcast a little bit differently as far as my location as I normally would on a Monday. Long story short, I had a foul corrupted, et cetera. No sympathies necessary, but a little bit of a restart, and just be patient with me on this in terms of location and sound and all those things. But hopefully a clear and concise podcast on this Monday. Later on this week, I can tell you already that I've already recorded this podcast with Glenn Willis talking about Trae Young. So that is the next player capsule on the horizon. Only a couple more left, and one of them is always fun to talk about Trey. That's coming up later on in the podcast and sort of later on this week on the podcast. And I should also say, today will be mostly focused on mailbag questions. There was a little bit of news, and I mean little, really little, on Monday, kind of midday. The Hawks already announced they actually are going to be requesting waivers on Joey Hauser. So that's not a huge surprise. Hauser, as I talked about on the podcast a couple times already this summer, was signed to an Exhibit 10 contract, and basically the maneuver there was most of the time those guys end up being waived and then moved to the G League. That is probably what's going to happen here. I haven't heard exactly why they did that before camp even started, but given that he was literally the last guy on the roster, I would imagine not a huge shock, even if it's kind of interesting timing before camp actually happens. With that said, the rest of the podcast will be your mailbag questions. Most of them are topical and timely, as I try to do that when I answer your mailbag questions. But I should say at the top of the show here, if you ever have questions for the podcast, I try to answer them on a regular basis. You can send them to me on Twitter/X at Locked On Hawks or at BT Rowland, my personal account. Also, if you want to send them in via email, you can do that at lockedonhawks@gmail.com. And then also, if you are a patron of mine over at patreon.com/BT Rowland, you can send some questions in there and I will answer them as well. All right. All that said, we can dive in now with a question that I've been actually holding for a while, but it's pretty interesting and kind of topical right now. And it comes from Josh, who says, with all the talks about the league expanding soon, which 8 players on the Hawks roster would you protect in a theoretical expansion draft? As Josh notes here, there's always talk about expansion, but Adam Silver's talking about this more and more, I think, coming up right now, kind of downplaying it sometimes, but also talking it up sometimes. I'm going to answer the question before I do that, though. Some news on the actual expansion front the last couple of weeks. And the consensus is still that the league is going to expand sooner rather than later. I would say there hasn't been expansion in more than 2 decades, which is actually crazy how long it's been. There's been some reporting focused on the 2027-28 season maybe as a logical start for expansion teams. Las Vegas and Seattle are the most likely landing spots, it seems like, but they're not absolute locks just yet. You hear about Mexico City, you hear about Kansas City, Louisville, Nashville, etc. I think it's probably going to be Vegas and Seattle when it happens, but TBD on all of that. If it's those 2 teams, by the way, then they probably have to change the East-West balance a little bit because those are 2 Western Conference teams. Probably choose a team to go to the East. Memphis, Minnesota, and New Orleans are all pretty logical geographical choices to move to the East if they add 2 teams in the West. But we'll see. Obviously, some politicking going on with all that stuff. That's not like what we're talking about today on the podcast. But anyway, there have been lots of fake expansion drafts on the internet in September. I would say it's a good topic in the offseason. I will admit that. Josh brings up the fact that the protecting of 8 players, that was the format last time there was expansion and a draft. technically teams had to leave at least one player under contract exposed to the draft, even if they had 8 guys or less. But the league is a little bit different now. We don't know what the official rules would be. Rosters are bigger, for instance, with 2 ways, etc. Not a guarantee they keep the same format, but still we'll operate like they're doing the same thing now for logical purposes to answer this question. So long preamble out of the way. The way that I would probably do this is to eliminate the players that I think are pretty easy to not protect. And as much as I like the Hawks 2-way guys, I can't imagine them protecting a 2-way guy. That'd be kind of shocking. So those guys, put them to the side. With due respect to David Roddy and Cody Zeller, I would say no chance to protect either one of those guys right now. Garrison Matthews, I think, is underrated and a pretty useful NBA player, but he's not a guy that you probably protect in an expansion draft universe. I think Mo Gay is definitely an upside player, but has not really shown anything at the NBA level through 2 seasons. So I wouldn't necessarily be banking on that. Well, I shouldn't say 2, I guess a season and a half. So it wouldn't. If you want to protect Mo Gay, I don't blame you, but second-round picks that haven't really proven anything, I wouldn't be itching to do that. Larry Nance is a good player, but you cut that pass on him probably as a 31-year-old on an expiring contract, so probably wouldn't protect him. It gets a little bit harder after that, but still some guys who I would eliminate pretty clearly. Everyone knows that listens to this podcast regularly knows how I feel about Clint Capella. I think I like Clint more than the consensus. At the same time, it's similar to Nance. He's a 30-year-old guy on an expiring contract who is obviously on the wrong side of his prime at this point. So he would be one to cross off. And then this is probably the one that's more on the margins. DeAndre Hunter is pretty widely seen in the league as a negative value asset on that contract in a vacuum. So it's tough to argue for a guy on a quote-unquote bad contract to protect, even though teams are generally higher on Hunter than Hawks fans are. I will say that. And also teams generally want those potential 6'8" guys who can shoot and defend. But I wouldn't protect him personally. So it's not terribly sexy, but in the Hawks case, if you just go through the eliminations, like I just did in a cut-down fashion, you get to 8 players that are remaining. And in my mind, those are the 8 that you would keep. So if you want to go the other way, the guys I will proactively pick here, there are 3 absolute and utter locks. It's Trae Young, it's Jalen Johnson, and it's Zach Ricochet. Obviously, the top 2 are the best players that are still on the underside of things, and Ricochet was the number 1 overall pick this year. Even if you are of the belief that he's not that kind of prospect, he's still a guy that they like a lot and they just drafted. Obviously, he'll be protected. Then you have 2 guys who are on good contracts, and that is Bogey and Okongwu. Okongwu has not been incredible to this point, but he's still a 23-year-old starting caliber player who has a cheap contract, who they like. And then Bogey was, for me, the best reserve in the league last year, a very clear top 80 player in the NBA at this point in time on a very, very favorable contract. So an auto keep there. That is 5. Number 6, Dyson Daniels, I think is an absolute lock. The combination of a cheap contract plus his defense plus his upside. He's 21 years old. I talked about him at length with Glenn Willis last week on the podcast in 2-part fashion, but Dyson's a guy that I like a lot and would be an easy keep for me. That's the 6 that are pretty obviously yeses. And then you have the 2 guys that are a little bit less clear. And I would say they're Kobe Buffkin and Vit Krejci. So for me, these are not the top 8 players right now. It's like if you want to play a game right now today, just to give the most obvious example, Clint Capella is better at basketball right now in an NBA game than Kobe Buffkin. It's not even close. It's very, very obvious. But contracts matter in this situation. Age matters. Future matters. And that allows you to keep Buffkin, who the Hawks just drafted with this same regime. I know there's some people that are down on him. I understand that. But this front office, this head coach drafted him about 15 months ago. So they're still in on him, obviously. He's cheap for 3 more years. I like him still. Pretty easy choice. And then Vit Krejci is unproven, to be sure, but his deal is fantastically team-friendly for the Hawks for 4 years. Vit is also the archetype that you want of a potential 2-way wing that every single team is looking for. I've been saying this all summer long. You cannot guarantee or bank on Vit's late season bump being real for sure. But if there's a chance that it is, you have to lean on that because of how cheap he is and the contract, the skill set, the age, all of those things. The upside of that on that deal is very, very high, and he was quite useful last year. So maybe you could argue if you wanted to, Mo Gay or DeAndre Hunter over Krejci or Buffkin. I wouldn't, but that would be the up in the air part of this conversation. I think the other 6 are very obvious. Just one more time: Trey, Jalen, Ricochet, Bogdanovich, Daniels, and Okongwu are pretty obviously yeses. And then there's maybe a little bit of flexibility, but for me, I didn't have too much trouble with this. I think it's a pretty clear top 8. Those 6 guys plus Buffkin plus Krejci, and you kind of lean with that. And maybe Mo Gale makes you look silly later on, but for as good as he is and potentially what he could be, he's still a second-round pick who was unproven and didn't play a lot last year. So he's probably the hardest cut. Hunter, you kind of know what Hunter is, I would say, after 6 years, all that stuff. But we'll leave it there for now. Good question here. And if this happens, I will be covering it a lot because it will be interesting decisions. It won't be happening now. If they did an expansion draft, it would be at least a year from now, if not 2 years from now. So there'll be some prep time for the teams and the Hawks and all that stuff. But yeah, good question at the top of the podcast. All right, we'll have more coming up on the show today, including more questions about like trade exceptions and all that kind of fun stuff, plus a little bit of a look at the end of the podcast into Trey, a potential awards consideration. First, though, a word from our partners at FanDuel Sportsbook. Football is here in a big way, and if you're an NFL fan, you can start the season this year with a big return at FanDuel. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook, and when you happen to get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out a ton of different informations and sites and all that stuff, from the latest stats to live play-by-play and much more, on the same page where you place your bets at FanDuel Sportsbook. You'll also get started with a great offer from FanDuel, and that is $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet with the folks at FanDuel. You should also know that FanDuel Sportsbook and the app there is really easy to use. They have everything you're looking for in the sports betting space, from over-unders to point spreads to live betting, money lines, player props, same-game parlays, future bets, and much more. The app is safe, it's secure, and it covers the entire range of sports as well. That includes the NBA, which we cover on this podcast all the time. WNBA in the playoffs right now, NFL, college football, baseball, hockey, golf, tennis, soccer, auto racing, boxing, MMA, and so much more. And now is an awesome time to sign up with the folks at FanDuel Sportsbook. Just visit FanDuel.com and get started right now with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. One more time, visit FanDuel.com and check out America's #1 sportsbook. All right, a question now from Corey, who says, what happened to the trade exception from John Collins? Does that just disappear, or did the Hawks use it somehow? It seems like a big waste after what a lot of us hoped for when they created it. So the answer here is that it did not disappear. In fact, the Hawks used it as part of the Dejounte Murray trade and created a new one in the process. Trust me, you do not want me to have to explain all of it because it's kind of not exciting and very cap nerdy, but it did happen. That was the hunch of some cap people, cap nerds, and I say that lovingly, when the deal happened. At the same time, I don't really know, how much that got out to the mainstream public. So this did happen. You can find that information. It's available now. But the new exception is actually even bigger. It's about $25.2 million in trade exception, expires on July 7th of this coming season. It is usable after the moratorium is over in July, which is very helpful. We'll get into this more later on, of course. There is some cap nerd stuff that I can explain about how it can be used, but the short version is the Hawks can use this exception to trade for a player who makes up to that money, about $25.2 million, without having to actually match salary, what they send out. Now, notably, the Hawks are hard capped right now at the first apron for this entire season. That can't change. They cannot go over $178.1 million in salary for any reason during the season. They knew that was going to be triggered when they made the trade to actually trigger it. They didn't care about that because, as I've said many times, they were not going to go over that number anyway, whether anybody likes it or not. That apron is actually above the tax line, so they technically could go into the tax, but they cannot go above that hard trigger apron for any reason this year. With that in the mix, you can't just add a big time salary right now during the season because that would put them over that number. Now, in the offseason, they could, in theory, just add a player of that, trade second round pick or whatever for a big time salary legally. But the more likely aspect of this exception would be to have it be helpful in the summer, but on like maybe a smaller scale, etc. A lot of these exceptions either don't get used or they get rolled up into another deal to create another one, like what happened here. You want to maintain the flexibility. But I tried to warn people at the time last summer that the Collins exception was not going to probably turn into magically some awesome player, because the Hawks do have, and I want to stress this, self-imposed salary restrictions that they don't want to go over. Now they have this hard cap, which they triggered on purpose. At least they knew they were going to trigger it. But anyway, it could come in handy, this exception. this summer. It's probable it won't be like some high profile thing, but it's at least possible. And it's not a bad thing to have in your back pocket to make some deals work, make some money work when you need to. Most likely, I would say, though, over the summer because of just where they are on the luxury side right now. Okay, question from Matt, who says, who is the biggest draft pick bust for the Hawks that you've been covering the team? Good question here from Matt. For reference, I've been covering the team since the 2011-2012 season. I won't do the whole backdrop, but for people that don't know this, I was a Hawks fan growing up, ticket holder in college, etc. I started covering the team, I would say, more and more professionally starting that year. I was in the locker room the whole time, but now it's a little bit different than it was then for sure. It's more of a full-time thing for me. But that's when I started covering the team. So that's kind of the purview of this question. So, for instance, I won't include my fan life before that, which means I won't talk about Sheldon Williams or Cal Bowdler or Ed Gray, Priest Lauderdale, Doug Edwards, DeMar Johnson, Rashawn McLeod, all this. I'll leave that alone. But for now, I will limit it to the actual time frame. This is a distinct question as well about who the biggest bust is and not who the most impactfully worst draft pick was. Different questions, I would say. And like, for example, here, Amari Spellman was a pick that I thought was completely ridiculous in the moment, and there is evidence of me saying that on this podcast. I hated it and said as much, but he's the 30th pick in the draft. So it's hard to be the biggest quote-unquote bust from the 30th pick in the draft. Whereas that pick didn't make sense to me ever, and it didn't work out well. You know, the impact of that, you could say, is a little bit more muted because it was that late in the draft. He's still on the list, I would say, but you have to take that spot into account, which is why I won't include second-round picks either. Like, I always say this, but the Hawks have gotten nothing from the second round for about a decade now, as crazy as that sounds. The last time the Hawks had any success in the second round, of course, pending Mo Gay, pending Jurisic, pending Seth Lane, those guys are at least still options on the board. But before that, it's Mike Scott and Mike Muscala. That's 10 years ago. Anyway, realistically, I think Spellman is on the list because it went so badly. I think, unfortunately, AJ Griffin has to be on the list now. He's going to be probably out of the league in 2 years. The Hawks traded him for a second-round pick after a year and a half, 2 years. I think Cam Reddish has to be on the list, given he was a top 10 pick and it did not go well. But the winner for me, as far as biggest draft bust, and I want to say again, draft bust only, is Adrian Payne. He was the 15th pick in the draft. And quite candidly, I liked that pick when it happened. I was very wrong, but I liked that pick when it happened. So I'm not always right about this stuff. The Hawks did make a stunningly smart move to trade him during his rookie season. That almost never happens for someone drafted that high. But the Hawks got out of it, so it didn't actually hurt them because that pick ended up being Kevin Huerter 4 years later, which is crazy. It had lots of machinations, but so in the process, you could argue that pick became Kevin Huerter, which works out really well for the Hawks. But as far as Payne's career was a disaster. He was out of the league very fast, and that would probably be the pick. Given he was drafted half a round ahead of Amari Spellman, had a similar flame out, I would say. Same range as AJ Griffin, but I will say about this about AJ. AJ actually was pretty good as a rookie, so at least there was some signs there. It was more off the court, motivational, mental health, all those questions about what happened with AJ. But I would argue Payne is the answer here, but the most impactfulness is probably Cam Reddish because that was a top 10 pick, and they kept playing him when it was actively hurting them, and they were trying to win at that point. Sometimes you play rookies in this rebuilding seasons where you're not really trying to win games. And that happened early in Cam's career. But once the Hawks were making playoff runs, they kept playing him and he was not helping them. So he was the highest pick that did not work out in this run. And look, DeAndre Hunter, this is why I made sure earlier to note that this is different process questions, most impactful versus trades and draft busts. I think that it's clear that DeAndre Hunter is not a draft bust. That trade was not a good one, and I didn't like it at the time. And I was probably one of the lone voices of the wilderness kind of yelling that was an overpay for DeAndre Hunter. But obviously, I don't think you are thrilled with what happened with DeAndre Hunter if you're the Hawks. But it was more of a draft trade process failure. And also, DeAndre Hunter is still in the league and is going to be in the league for a long time. Bust is an interesting term, but he wouldn't be on the list, for example. Obviously, people are going to bring up Trey and Luka and all that stuff, but Trae Young is a potential Hall of Fame basketball player. Even if you didn't like the trade, even if the Hawks probably wouldn't do that trade again, he's not a bust by any stretch of the imagination. So there's nuance here. That's my list. I would say Payne is probably the winner as far as the answer to the actual question. maybe we'll get into worst process or worst pick at some point in time, but you got Payne, Reddish, Spellman down the list, AJ, unfortunately, at this point, and that's probably it. So not a whole lot of disasters. Like the Hawks traded some picks in this time frame. DeAndre Bembry might be on the list too. Like it didn't go very well, but like he was in the league for a while. It was also a pick in the 20s, so the impact of that is lower. We'll leave it there for now. But if you don't like that answer, you can ask me to expand on it at some point in time, and maybe I will. Okay. We got at least one more question coming. I promise you on that, maybe two. We'll see. At least one more, though. But first, though, a word from our partners from eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience for the formula of winning championships. It's also what keeps your ride or die alive. And eBay Motors, they have everything you need to maintain your vehicle and also level it up to peak performance. They have superchargers, they have roof racks, they have exhaust kits, they have LED headlights, and so many more things. Whether you are into speed, into power, or into style, eBay Motors has you covered across the board. They have over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, and you will always find exactly what you're looking for at eBay Motors. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you are burning rubber, but you are crucially not burning cash. Of all the parts that you need at the price that you're looking for, it is easy to turn that car or SUV or truck that you have into the MVP that you're looking for and bring home that win that everybody is seeking, including me. Keep your ride or die alive right now at ebaymotors.com. One more time, the place to go is ebaymotors.com. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. All right, a question from Jordan who says, on Friday, I read that you replied to a question from Malik Brown on Twitter, and it was actually one that I thought about asking you myself at some point. Do you think that there is any chance Trae Young could get into MVP discussions, or is that impossible with the way that he is hated on? Thanks for the question, Jordan. The tweet that you're referring to was Malik asking how crazy it would be in his mind to think about Trey getting in the conversation at MVP. Not winning it, just a conversation. And look, I'm not going to lie to you on the podcast. I think it's very unlikely that Trey wins MVP. A lot has to go right for him to get in the conversation, I would say, as far as like the real inner circle contender conversation where you get like top votes. And part of that, to Jordan's framing, which is kind of funny about the way he's hated on, is that I would frame it as the perception mattering in award voting. And when the league is pretty low, in my opinion, on Trae Young, on him in the whole, I should say, it makes it tougher for him to win MVP because you have to change more minds. Perception is reality, all that said. Now, I do think there is an actual path that is conceivable. That does not mean it's likely. In fact, it's, again, very unlikely to happen, but it's conceivable, which is, I would say, different from a lot of guys that might get mentioned in the same kind of range as far as the odds are concerned. For instance, at FanDuel, as I'm recording this podcast, Trey is 250 to 1 to win MVP. That's worse odds than Damian Lillard. That's worse odds than Anthony Davis. Worse odds than De'Aaron Fox. The same odds as Domantas Sabonis and Jimmy Butler and Paul George. And again, those guys are all all-star players. I'm not picking on any of them. But if you go one by one, I don't really see the MVP pathway even for someone like Lillard or someone like Fox or Sabonis or Butler or George because they don't really marry the stats you have to have to win MVP. You have to have huge stats. Whether you should or not, different discussion. You have to have huge stats, and you have to be the best player on your team. And for Lillard, it's not the best player on his team. Giannis is very clearly better than Damian Lillard at this point. Not even close. For the Kings guys, they would probably split. Even if the Kings had this awesome 61 season, you probably get a split of some kind between Fox and Sabonis. Paul George has Embiid. And yes, I guess if Embiid got hurt, maybe you get a bump, but like they wouldn't be very good if Embiid got hurt. And also Tyrese Maxey is still on that team, so he would get some credit for it as well. Jimmy Butler have been great for a long time. I don't think he can put the stats that you need to win MVP. I don't really see that happening. Anthony Davis, the Lakers are not my favorite roster construction right now. I think LeBron and AD are obviously 1 and 2 on that team. AD is a monster, and I think he is underrated at this point, honestly. But like MVP, is he going to average what you have to average on offense to win MVP? And if he does, wouldn't LeBron get credit for that too if they were good enough as a team? So anyway, the way that I responded to Malik is part of the answer here. And that is that the Hawks would have to overachieve projections. That's part of the recipe for having this be realistic. I think the Hawks probably have to be like a top 3 or 4 seed in the East, realistically, for Trey to win MVP, which means 50 wins. If the Hawks won 50 games, Trey would rightfully get credit for that. Not by himself, but there's no pathway for the Hawks to be that good and Trey not be really awesome, given their roster. So in theory, you have to just project Trey to be awesome and have them win that many games. He'd get a lot of credit for that. Team factors and team results get factored in. They just do. I always use this Bogey example, but last year I think Bogey would have won Sixth Man of the Year if the Hawks didn't have the record they had. Was that Bogey's fault? Absolutely not. They were awesome with Bogey played on the court, et cetera, but he got overlooked because of the team record. MVP is even more stark. Guys don't win MVP on bad teams or even middling teams. You got to win 45 games plus to even have a prayer. And if you're going to win 45, 46 games, you got to have an incredible resume. Like Russell Westbrook had the triple-double average, that kind of thing. Or Jokic. Anyway, I don't see that happen for Trey. I think Trey have to be a 50-win team plus the numbers. And that's the big thing here. One more time. Trey can put up the stats you need to MVP. He is capable of it. He's already kind of done it in some respects. But, like, it's not impossible. I think Trey could average 30 and 10. And if you do that, that checks enough boxes. So, again, the question is there any chance Trey could be in the discussion of MVP? I would say, yes, there is a chance. It is a small one. There is a chance. It's not likely at all, but here's the formula. I just said it in some sort of roundabout way, but here's the actual formula. Trey averages 28 points a game on good efficiency, leads the league in assists, which is very plausible. He led the league in assists before. He was number 2 in the league last year. And the Hawks win 50 games. If all three of those things happen, Trey becomes someone that can be in the conversation. Doesn't mean he's going to win it, but someone is in that's all plausible to me. But then if that all happens and you still get an outlier Jokic season or an outlier Lucas season or an outlier Shea season or Giannis comes back or whatever, those guys would still get the tiebreaker edge on Trey for recent history and projection, respect from the league, all those things. So you kind of need Trey to do all those things and then have nobody else blow you away. That's the formula for Trey to win MVP. So I wouldn't make on that obviously happening. That's a lot of ifs that have to happen. I would argue, I think you could easily, and I probably would argue that 250 to 1 is a little bit too high based on what he actually could do to get in the conversation. Should he be 50 to 1? No, it probably should be like 100 to 1, something like that. I'm not even sure how you would break that down. I do think that his odds are a little bit too long right now at FanDuel, just personally. But again, I'm not saying you have to bet on him. And if you do, I would take it really easy because it's not going to happen probably. But yeah, there's a pathway because of the numbers. Like I said, I won't list all the guys, but I need a bunch of them who are in that top like 20 odds range that I think have no chance. And that's not their fault. It's just the situation. Like they either have the lack of team success, they either have another guy on their team that is either better than them or as good as them, or they can't put the numbers up. Trey is the best player by far on his team. He has the numbers potential. And I think the Hawks, while I would not pick this, could win 50 games this year. It would not blow me away. I would not fall on the floor if they did that. So that combination means that, yeah, there's a prayer, a wink and a prayer, however you want to say that. There you go. All right, before we get out of here, I want to always note something that's actually not basketball related, but I want to shout out something that the Hawks do actually. The Hawks and State Farm, the company, partnered and had 6,000 volunteers at the arena on Saturday, a couple of days ago, to pack more than 1 million meals that'll be distributed throughout the Atlanta area through an organization called U.S. Hunger, and then a bunch of partners like food banks and nonprofits to distribute all that stuff. Neek was there. Steve Kunin was there. 4 players, Dyson Daniels, Larry Nance, Onyeka Kongwu, David Roddy were all there as well, supporting the volunteers, volunteering themselves. And they actually set a new record for how fast they did it. They did the entire thing in like 8 hours, which is pretty crazy. It's the 4th time this has happened where the Hawks have done this million meal pack event. And honestly, I don't talk about community stuff a lot. It's a basketball podcast. I thought it was really cool. And it's something the Hawks can do that can use their power to impact good things. So just want to shout that out. They made their rounds on Twitter this weekend, as it should have. The players were there on the scene to kind of get a little bit more attention to it. So good stuff there from the Hawks. Anyway, we'll have more coming up this week on the podcast. I will plan to have 4 or 5 episodes each week moving forward. I did 5 last week. Again, just want to plug that. Anthony Irwin was on the show. Glenn Willis is on the show. We'll have more from Glenn this week. At some point, we're going to fire up the over-under machine with Robbie Callan, so stay tuned for all of that. And then Media Day, I'll be on the scene a week from today for all those festivities. We're getting closer and closer and closer to the season, so please go ahead and subscribe if you've not already done that already. If you have, I appreciate it. Keep it going. Download the podcast on multiple platforms. Go ahead and subscribe on YouTube and an audio platform. Someone asked me this the other day. Actually, like, how do I do this? If you're a YouTube subscriber, I definitely value and thank you for doing that. Please also, if you want to do me a favor, to subscribe to the show on audio as well and download it. Even if you want to watch on YouTube, that's totally cool. But please also do it on audio. That helps me out tremendously. Also, tell your friends about the podcast. Tell your Hawks fan friends in particular. Share it on social media or Reddit or Facebook or Instagram, any place you want to find it. Go ahead and share the podcast. We're getting very close, and I appreciate everybody listening to the podcast. Stay tuned. We'll have more coming up later on this week. Follow us on Twitter /X @LockedOnHawks. Follow me there @BT Rowland. Follow my non-podcast work at patreon.com/BT Rowland, and we'll see you all next time.